أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum everyone. It's really good to be back at the week in Madrasah. I think, how long has it been? 3 months since I've seen some of you. There's some new faces here that I haven't seen before, so welcome for those of you who are just coming in. For those who I think are familiar, it's good to see you guys again, inshallah. So the premise of this talk, I think, has been perfectly elucidated by Sheikh Hamid, and this is just an informal setting. Like, feel free to ask and discuss whatever you want. We're not going to judge. Nobody's going to, literally beat you with a stick or anything like that. Feel free to question and ask anything that you may have at the back of your mind. Just to introduce myself, for those of you who don't know me. So I was born and raised in Kuwait. It's a very small country in the Middle East, right? My parents are Pakistani, right? I speak Punjabi, so that's my background. Then when I was 18, I left to the UK for my studies. So UK has been a very heavy part of my life. I was in Bath. You guys know Bath down south in UK, right? I was there for about 3 years, did my degree in chemical engineering. And when I graduated, I came out top of my class. So I was offered a PhD studentship in Nottingham University. You guys know Robin Hood, right? So the association with Nottingham. I finished that in about 2015, and then I went to Dubai, and that's where I've started teaching physics, chemistry, and mathematics. But since then, I've now, changing my field more towards Islamic theology and this whole discussion about science and religion. My research mainly looks at, new atheism in Islam, how to look at the relationship between science and Islam, and just general aspects of Islamic theology, what basically makes Islam an intellectual tradition, right? So that's my formal background. And Sheikh Hamid said, why don't we do something like this where we can have a hands-off, one-to-one engagement with some of the kids? I'm like, why not? That'd be a pretty cool idea. Because in the climate that we're in today, I think it's very obvious that I think Muslims, and I think generally people who believe in God, are being pressed to ask some very difficult questions, right? Things like, I'm sure you know, on Fox News media, people have depicted Muslims as these barbaric, stupid, terroristic, people. Atheists seem to be coming in with all sorts of questions. I think the problem of evil is a big one. We'll unpack these as we go along, but I'm just stating what these are for now. The idea of evolution, as Sheikh Hamid mentioned, that evolution, Muslims seem to pick up evolution. They think, finish, I don't believe in God anymore, right? So all of these are very, they're not straightforward, but they're nonetheless interesting and difficult questions, which I think we now need to start addressing. The problem, at least as far as I can see, is that we have people who are in places of authority like imams and stuff like that. But unfortunately, some of the tools that they have are not adequate enough to maybe address some of these questions. To really tackle these head on, I think you now need to start being an interdisciplinary thinker. What I mean by that is that in addition to learning, your Islamic studies, you also now need to couple that with other kinds of disciplines, including science and philosophy. And only when you can, get a good ground in all three can you really adequately address these kinds of questions. And that's my particular background. That's why I feel that this is a very needed space, and it invites a lot of questions that I think need addressing. So alhamdulillah, we have a few people now who are really looking into this, trying to find adequate solutions. I think one of the most pressing ones, at least coming out from science, I think the two big ones are quantum mechanics. Have you guys heard of quantum mechanics before? Yeah, in school? Some of you say no, that's fine. And evolution. You all heard of evolution, right? I'm sure that's a big one that presses on a lot of your minds. So those are the two big ones that I think really put students in a lot of uncertainty about their faith. So given that preamble, what I wanted to do was just open the floor to you guys to see what sort of questions that you had. You can even mention any comments. You don't even need to ask a question, and then we can take it from there. I already got some questions here, right? But I'll first leave it to the floor. So do you have something?
Yeah.
Sure. What's up?
How does evolution oppose our faith?
Okay, that's, I think, a very good question. So how does evolution oppose our faith, right? So just to get a quick show of hands, yeah.
Can you also unpack what evolution is?
Right, yeah, what evolution is. So let me first explain what evolution is, right? Because there are problems with how sometimes people understand what evolution is. I think the common idea that seems to be running on a lot of people's mind is that humans came from monkeys. You guys heard of that? Yeah? That's not evolution. That's the false understanding of evolution. That ain't evolution, right? So evolution simply says that if you, so anybody know how old Earth is? How many years? Come on, guys. How many? Yeah.
14 billion.
That's the universe, the Earth I'm talking about. Yeah.
4.5 billion.
Excellent. Yeah. So it's about 4.5 billion years old, right? That's a very, very long time. It's a very, very long time, right? So during the span of the existence of the Earth, what ended up happening, according to the theory of evolution, that certain, kind of cells started getting together, and then the first life was made, right? And then these cells started multiplying and evolving into more complex creatures. So one of the first kind of creatures that appear on Earth are things like fish, so people, animals in the sea. Then eventually over time, due to various aspects of genes, mutating and stuff like that, those fish animals became more complex, such that we started getting land animals. So when fish started going onto land. And then from there, you keep on getting more complex creatures. And these creatures diversify based on the landscape that they're in. So eventually, if you have one animal, and let's say you have the same animal, but that they go on to two different environments, based on the environments, it pushes their genes to evolve in certain ways. That's what evolution does. And if you stretch this over a period of 1 million years, right, you get the biodiversity that we see today. So we have thousands of animals that we know, and 99% of them are extinct from the dawn of life on Earth. So from that aspect, we can sort of try and connect these species together in something called a phylogenetic tree. So there's a tree in which you start off with these very early creatures, and then it grows into these like tree-like structures. Have you guys seen that diagram that I'm talking about? Yeah, so that's what evolution is. That all animals, including humans, are part and parcel of this evolutionary mechanism. So that's what evolution means, scientifically at least, right? So given that explanation, now the question is, what's your name?
Umar.
Huh? Umair.
Yeah.
Very good question. So how old are you?
13.
You're 13. Wow. Okay. Very good. I mean, I was just sucking on my thumb and playing PlayStation when I was 13, right? So very good. So when it comes to now our faith, how is this problematic, right? So I think the biggest concern for most people when it comes to evolution in Islam is the Quran. This seems to be, I think, the biggest issue. There's several others, but we don't need to get into those right now. They don't seem to be as important. So if you read the Quran and Hadith, okay, the Quran seems to indicate, okay, there are many verses that talk about the creation of Adam, but it seems to indicate that Adam was just created out of nothing and he popped onto the planet. That's what our Quran tells us or indicates towards us, right? Evolution says, however, that Adam didn't just pop into existence out of nowhere. God didn't just bring him out of non-existence into existence onto planet Earth. Evolution tells us that Adam, the Prophet Adam, he was part and parcel of this evolutionary makeup, which means that Adam must have had parents, but not necessarily human parents. That's the point, right? So this is now where you get a little bit of conflict coming into place. So to give you one example, right? So after the Quran, we have a bunch of hadiths. Everyone knows what hadiths are, right? So these are like the sources which we use to substantiate trying to understand the Quran. And what's the most authentic book? Who knows? Yeah. Sahih al-Bukhari. Excellent, right. Is that the only hadith book? No, there are many others, right? So we've got Sahih al-Bukhari. And in Sahih al-Bukhari, there's, I think it's Sahih al-Bukhari or Muslim, but in one of those two, which are the two most authentic books, there's a hadith which says that Adam, Adam says that it says that Adam was about 60 cubits tall, right? So to put it in today's time, what 60 cubits mean? It means about 30 meters tall. Okay, it means about 30 meters. So have any of you guys seen 30-meter tall human beings? No. Okay. Now the problem is that here we have a very strongly substantiated hadith that seems to tell us that the first man was 30 meters tall. And the hadith goes on to continue that over time, the people started getting smaller and smaller until they reached our size, basically. So the tallest human being that we know today, according to all our evidences, historical, archaeological, etc., is about 2.75 meters. That's a whole magnitude smaller than Adam, okay? Now, the reason why this hadith is a little bit problematic is because from the scientific side, one, we don't seem to have any evidence of people being that tall, number one. I'm not talking about animals. Other animals can be that tall. I'm saying human beings with this particular structure, so 2 arms, 2 legs, the lungs here, the heart here, with this particular structure, with this particular anatomy, human beings can never be that tall. This is what our biology seems to tell us. So when we have the sciences telling us that human beings cannot go, the maximum that scientists seem to indicate is about 3.6 meters. That is the maximum that they can go. And the reason why they say that is because, hang on, any of you want to become doctors? Raise your hands up if you want to become doctors or medics anytime soon. Oh wow, that's a very anti-Muslim thing. No Muslim doctors in this crowd. Wow, okay. Right, usually it's engineers and, okay, any engineers in the house who want to be engineers? Oh, a few, okay, so you're keeping the sunnah alive. Well done, okay. Right. Cool, right, so now from the sciences, like I said, we have this issue of that if human beings were taller than 3.6 meters, the problem with that is that you have your heart. Where's your heart? On the left or on the right? So why are you pointing on your right? So it's on your left, right? It's on your left-hand side, right? Now, if you're taller than 3.6, so what does the heart do? It pumps what around the body? Blood, right? So what ends up happening is that if you're too tall, the amount of pressure that comes on the heart because of the height is too much, such that the heart will explode. And those things that carry the blood around your body, what are they called? Starts with B and A. Veins and arteries, very good. Okay, so veins and arteries, those will explode. So from our sciences, these are indications that human beings cannot be this tall. So now you see there's an immediate conflict between what science is telling us and what our scripture is telling us. Everyone okay with that problem now? So now the question is, where do we go from here, right? Where do we go from here? Is this pretty much a conflict zone and that's it? We can't do much about it? Now, I'm going to try and I'll stick to this hadith and explain to you how different people have tried to think about these issues, okay? People are still trying hard to understand what is the interface between evolution and Islam like. People have read about evolution and they think they've left Islam, and they think that undermines all of Islam, so therefore they leave it. Some people are trying to navigate through these difficulties and come up with solutions. Here are some, okay? I'm not trying to give you any definitive answers. I'm just telling you that it's complex. There are complexities involved in these answers. Yes?
When you're saying people,
Yeah.
who are these people?
Why do you gotta make my life difficult? Right. So by people I mean individuals like myself who are interested in the relationship between science and religion. So there is somebody called Dr. Rana Dajani who was, I think, in the event in January. I don't know if some of you guys, I think you met her last time, right? Somebody called Dr. Nidal Ghassam. Recently, there's a doctor from Jordan. He's in Yarmouk University, Dr. Basel Al-Ta'i. He's written something about this. So there's a few growing numbers talking about these discussions, okay? Now, one of the things that I should just tell you clearly, right? That in order to try and understand this debate, you have to be at least relatively well versed in both the sciences and the Quran and Hadith. If you only come from one specialization, your answer won't be able to have that much substantiation. Does that make sense? Because I have seen people who are, mashallah, excellent in their sciences, they're very good in their sciences, but when they try to, try and give suggestions, they really have no clue what they're talking about, at least when it comes to the Quran and Hadith. And vice versa. You have imams sometimes who are excellent in their fields. I'm not gonna, take that, destroy that credit from them. But when it comes to now entertaining such questions, they don't have the necessary knowledge to, address these. So the advice that I really want to just convey is make sure that if you do want to explore this, have some understanding of both fields. This is very, very important. Otherwise, you're just going to have half-baked solutions, okay? To give you one idea, right? There's one of my friends, he's from Iraq, okay? And he told me about a particular imam. And he's, solid in his hadith, knows the Quran inside out, very good in his fiqh, etc., right? And somebody asked him about how planes fly. Planes, planes, yeah? So how they work. Now, all of you have been on a plane, right? Hands up if you've been on a plane. Right, all of you have been on a plane, right? So, what's your name? Yeah, where have you flown before?
Ireland.
Ireland. Wow, that's far. Okay. So, just kidding. Right. So, you've flown to Ireland. Where? Belfast, I'm guessing? Okay, cool. So, you took the plane from London and then it flew straight to Belfast, right? And then it landed in the airport. Correct. Right. So, that's how planes work, right? You go to an airport and then you go to your targeted journey directly through the plane. Okay? Keeping that in mind, when this Imam was asked, how do planes work? He gave the most brilliant answers I've ever heard in my life, right? He said, every flight in the world goes through Palestine first, then its journey, then its final target. Why? What was his evidence? He said, you remember that famous incident in the life of the Prophet ﷺ when he went to the heavens? Do you guys know what that episode is called? Isra Mi'raj, right? So what was the first thing? Where did he go first? He went through Palestine, Masjid al-Aqsa, and then he went up, right? So that was his evidence to say that every flight in the world goes through Palestine first and then to the target. So according to him, you didn't go to Belfast first, you went to Palestine, then to Belfast. Does that make sense to you guys? If you shook your head and you said yes, there's something wrong with you, right? So no, that is problematic. That is scientifically unviable. That doesn't make sense, right? So like I said, he may know his Quran and Hadith inside out, but now because he's not educated about science, he makes absurd claims. So you have to balance both things side by side. Let's get back to the Hadith, okay? So I'm going to try and show you how different people have tried to interpret the sciences and the Hadith, okay? So some people take a very hard stance. They will say that this is our hadith, we're not going to compromise, we have to reject the science. This is one position. This is one possible position that people have taken up, okay? So they say this hadith is in Bukhari or Muslim, we cannot compromise on our principles, so we take it as it is. Whatever the science says, we neglect, okay? So some people say that evolution may be true, but it may not be true for human beings. It may not be true for human beings are the exception to the rule. Now from a scientific point of view, this is problematic because we have sufficient evidence. So you know something called DNA? You guys know what DNA is? Yeah? So we have evidences from our genetics and our DNA to really strongly substantiate that human beings were a product of evolution. How that takes place, we don't need to get into, but there is a lot of evidence for that. So we have this kind of position involved. That's the first kind. Some people say, okay, hang on. Maybe we can interpret the hadith metaphorically. This is one possible option, okay? So person X says, okay, so it means 60, about 30 meters, about 60 cubits. We can interpret that as maybe being something very, very tall, not necessarily being literally like 30 meters tall, right? Now, in the Arabic language, however, somebody could criticize this position and say, in Arabic, the numbers so you know how when you want to use exaggeration in English, what are the numbers that you use? If you want to say, I've done that so many times, you usually use numbers, right? What kind of numbers do you use? 100, 1,000, million, billion times, right? Those are the expressions we use, right? Now, in the Arabic language at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, right? They also use numbers for exaggeration, but those numbers are different to our numbers in English. Those numbers would be anything to do like 7, 70, or 700, right? Those were the numbers which the Arabs at that time used for exaggeration. The hadith doesn't use those numbers. So somebody could criticize this position and say, you're stretching it a little bit here. It's not really applicable to be a metaphor. So this could be a possible position, but then it has this following difficulty, right? Another option is as follows, right? Some people could say, hang on, let's check the strength of the hadith. Okay, we know that's in Bukhari, no problem, but let's check the strength, okay? Now, for those of you who go on to study about hadith, right, you will know that hadith comes in many different grades, right? So the lowest grade is called an ahad hadith. What is it called? Ahad hadith, okay? The next grade is called mashhur. What is it called? Mashhur. And the third, this is the strongest grade, it's called mutawatir. What is it called? Mutawatir. So the Quran is mutawatir. It is the highest strength of transmission from the Prophet ﷺ to our time, okay? The hadiths, however, are not uniformly mutawatir. They come under the grade of mashhur and ahad. Now, why is this important? Because depending on the grade, you can appropriate them based on certain evidences without falling into certain theological problems. For example, if somebody rejects an ahad hadith, which is the lowest grading, if somebody rejects that hadith, there is no theological blame on them. They won't like become outside of Islam. There's no problem like that whatsoever. If somebody rejects a mashhur hadith, it is problematic a little bit, because it doesn't necessarily mean that they're outside of Islam, but they're outside now of mainstream. You know this term Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, right? The idea of orthodoxy. So this is like our mainstream, which is we consider as our core body. Outside of this body, you are like going on heretical tones a little bit, and then outside of that, you are outside the fold of Islam. So if you reject mashhur, you're not outside the fold of Islam, but you're outside of mainstream. Mutawatir, if you reject a mutawatir hadith, you are outside the fold of Islam. So do you see how the different classifications have different implications, right? Now, somebody could say, this hadith is an ahad hadith. So if the science is substantial enough, if the science is strong enough, we can reject it. And nobody will be to blame. So this is a possible hadith. But somebody might say, hang on, it's not, you cannot just dismiss it so easily because of X and Y and Z reasons. So just from that overview, I hope you understand that discussion is very complicated. There's no one way to approach this. People have tried to look hard into both sides and try to come up with narratives. My own self, I'm actually working on a book on evolution in Islam from Ghazali's perspective. For those of you who don't know, Imam Ghazali is like one of the biggest greats of Islamic history, alongside, Ibn Taymiyyah, various others like Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi, etc. All these are big names, right? So I'm trying to see if we can take maybe some of Ghazali's principles, Imam Ghazali's principles, and try and see whether we can focus on this. And in my personal view, I think that we can reach a position which doesn't compromise either. I think it is viable, but it still requires a little bit of research to make any definitive conclusions. I think we have to just, in light of what I'm trying to tell you here, is that you will find difference of opinions on this particular issue. I've recently written a book called Atheism and Islam, which is like a short review of the interface. And one of the sections I have there is how Muslims have looked at this discussion of evolution in Islam, and there are 15 opinions on that paper. Each person has a different position for different reasons, right? So you're not going to really get a consensus. People are looking at it from different angles, and it's up to you to make your own decision about it. But is evolution enough? Is it enough to allow you to become an atheist? I don't think so. I don't see why it's a problem. Putting this hadith aside for a second, somebody could even say evolution is in conflict with Islam because it tells us that, nature did all these processes along the way and man just popped out without any God's interference. However, there's no problem saying, if you wanted to believe evolution, there's no problem saying that Allah could have created Adam just like that, or he could have created Adam through the process of evolution. It's completely possible for God to do that. Completely possible. And some people have maintained that position. It's called theistic evolution, this position. So it's the idea that God, he directed all the evolutionary processes throughout time, and then Adam was one output of that process. So people have held that position. So I hope that clarifies a lot of complexities in this discussion. I'm not trying to say to you that I have the answers. I'm just trying to say, these are the complications. What do you think? Right? That would be my way of sort of giving you that response. Does that help? Yeah? Does that help? Right. From the sister side, anybody have a question? Yeah.
So from your analysis of Adam alayhi salam and being 6 cubit and the deduction that the human anatomy now cannot work,
Yeah.
being that tall because the arteries would explode and this and that.
Yeah.
Is that not using the atmosphere and the world that we are in now?
Yeah.
And because after having discussions myself with others, we came to the possible conclusion that, the atmosphere didn't have to be the atmosphere that we are in now.
Yeah.
It's not like retrofitting
Yeah.
from before.
Sure.
The atmosphere and the mechanisms that are in the air,
Yeah.
and the tectonic plates and where everybody was situated
Right.
4.5 billion years ago
Yeah.
could have been different.
Yeah.
And therefore, as a consequence,
Yeah.
the possibilities of humans being that tall and being sustainable
Yeah.
could have been possible.
Right. So you're right. So very good question. So I was actually speaking about this with Sheikh Usman. You guys know Sheikh Usman, right? I think he comes here quite frequently. So we were having this discussion just the other day. So you're right that it's definitely in the realm of possibilities that Adam could have been that tall. The only problem with that is that life started only quite recently, right? From the Cambrian explosion, right? It wasn't 4.5 billion years per se, it was much later on. Earth started 4.5 billion years ago, but life started on much more later than the existence of planet Earth. Now the thing is, the atmospherical conditions which allowed the first life to exist has relatively been stable since then, right? The oxygen levels may have varied a little bit, carbon dioxide may have varied a little bit, but in terms of pressure, temperature, humidity, all of those have been relatively stable. So we have good grounds to suggest that even though there might have been subtle differences in the environmental conditions, it is still not enough to permit human entities to be that tall. Because it's more of a question than physics than it is biology. In physics, we have this idea of gravitational constant and all those, right? Within those gravitational constants, because gravity doesn't change, it hasn't changed, right? It's been there pretty consistently. But that gravitational pull on entities has been relatively stable, which then blocks the sort of heights that you can imagine. Now, I'm not saying that no animal can be tall. There have been animals that have been taller than human beings, Brontosaurus, T-Rex, etc. Jurassic Park, you know what I'm talking about, right? So those kinds of things have existed, but then their anatomy has completely shifted. So the T-Rex, for instance, he had a very long tail and short legs to counterbalance his weight. The bone density of those animals are much more different to ours. We have a specific density in our bone. We have a specific kind of genetic makeup, specific kind of diet that really puts pressures. They're called biological functional limits on our body to be that tall. I'm not saying that it's impossible. There may be some science that may tell us otherwise, but I'm just saying that what science seems to be telling us right now is that it seems to be a limit. There's a capped limit on how tall humans could be. But I personally don't negate that. That could be still possible, that in maybe some environmental condition, human beings could be that tall, possibly. Yes, Joria.
That's fine, yeah. I will forward that to Sheikh Usman and then we'll discuss it, and then perhaps if we see each other again in these conferences, we'll talk more.
Yeah. He has even more radical views than me, but I won't touch into that. So yes.
How do scientists know that apes were the first things we had?
Okay, so scientists never made the claim that apes were the first thing. That no scientist has ever said that, as far as I know. What scientists claim is that in the very beginning there were a couple of maybe amino acids and some protein molecules basically that sort of got together and started forming life. That is still a big scientific question. How did we get life from matter that didn't have life? That's the problem of biogenesis. So, the process started off with these very basic, cells, and they start collecting together, and then over time they start forming these complex creatures over time. But as far as I know, no scientist has ever said that the first life was apes. That's a myth. If anyone told you that. Yeah, go ahead.
Why are there not any fossils that prove that humans were 30 cubic meters?
Why? Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Why are there not any fossils that prove that humans were 30 cubic meters?
Okay, so sorry if I've been mistaken. So the hadith says 60 cubits, and 60 cubits in our time means 30 meters. So it doesn't say 30 cubits, it means 30 meters, right? So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Second of all, scientists keep discovering new things from archaeology, right? They keep discovering new entities. So just because we haven't found doesn't mean there aren't any. There could be. There could very well be some skeletons that could be that tall. Could be. I'm not saying that it's impossible. Whether they've found or not is because I think scientists are still trying to uncover various aspects. Because it's not an easy thing, right? See, as you go back in history, the population of Earth begins to decrease, right? What's the population size right now? Anybody know? About 7 to 9 billion, I think about 8 billion now touching it, right? As you go back in time, we get smaller and smaller groups of people. And they're scattered all across the world. So that means uncovering fossils is a bit more difficult. So maybe that may play a part. It could be that different environments have different layers of mud and sand, etc., so making it harder to drill. You can think of a variety of reasons. I'm not saying that they will discover such fossils. Maybe they will never discover it. But the reasons for why science at least has been unable to cover is because of some of these complexities. I hope that answers your question. Cool. Right, yes, Brother Daniel.
Have fossils been falsified through evolution?
Okay, so this is a very good question. Okay, give him a badge. You know, you have the badge system, so this is a very good question. All right, you wanna repeat your question?
Oh, yes, have fossils been falsified to prove evolution?
Okay, have fossils been falsified to prove evolution? Okay, in fact, it's been the reverse. Okay, that fossils have been found that actually confirm evolution. Okay, so I want to make this as simple as possible. So, okay, let's play a little game, a mental game, before I answer your question, just to make it a little bit easier to understand. All right, now imagine you're in the middle of the desert. Okay, just imagine, right? And it's hot. Very sticky. I know I've been there. I hate Dubai because of the hotness and stickiness, right? So, but imagine you're in the desert. All of a sudden, you see a bunch of footsteps on the sand. Okay? What does that tell you? Someone else has been there. Have you seen that person? No, but you can tell from the footsteps that somebody was there, right? Now, you go to the footsteps and you notice that it's of a particular size. It's of a very long size, okay? Now, let's just say in this scenario, you know only 3 people out of the village next to you that actually have such a foot size. So just from that length of the foot, you can infer that it can only be one of these 3 people. Does that make sense, right? Even though you have never seen the person, right? And as you can pick up more and more evidence, you can narrow it down to who it was. Does that make sense? Yeah? So you're using inferences to reach a particular conclusion based on substantiated evidences. Everyone following me, right? Now, evolution works just like that. Science works just like that. We can make inferences about things which we don't have direct access to, okay? One of those inferences is the fossil record. For those of you who don't know what the fossil record is, it's simply this idea that if we go down deeper into Earth and we, find these skeletons and etc., we can come up with some kind of story in how all of these came into existence. The best theory that we have to offer is the theory of evolution, all right? Now, in addition to the fossil record, which is to do with finding skeletons and fossils and ambers inside the ground, we also have other lines of evidence to sort of substantiate that claim. One of those evidences is called anatomical structures, where you look at the anatomy and you try and link them to the families of the groups that they belong to. For example, our anatomy is relatively similar to a chimpanzee, right? But it's not the same thing as a rat, for instance. So we can distinguish between these things. That's one way of doing it. The strongest method that has come out in terms of determining evolution is genetics. So your DNA, your genes are made out of these various proteins, right? And they have to be linked up in a certain way. So when we see the genetic makeup through time based on genetic samples, etc., we see that our gene fits perfectly in the historical progression of the DNA buildup. That is actually our strongest evidence. So fossil record, even if there are gaps in there, it doesn't really break down the narrative of evolution because it's not the strongest evidence for evolution. The stronger evidence comes from the genetics. Now, let me show you now how evolution actually is substantiated by the fossil record. So now the fossil record is not clean. We have holes in our pockets, okay? We have holes in our data sets. So sometimes we may have species from a certain time period, we may have nothing for a while, and then we may have some other data sets. So we have these holes, we have gaping holes in evolution. No one denies that. Scientists don't deny that. They clearly say, we don't have the entire data set. That's fine, okay. Now, however, in the areas in which there are gaps, can we make any predictions which we can then say a certain finding will confirm the theory of evolution? That has happened. That has happened. So, I'll give you an example, right? So, I told you that the very first species that came out were in the sea, right? So, fish-like structures. Now, then there are animals that came onto land, so they had legs, right? Now, between being a fish and a land creature, there must have been some intermediate kind of animal that had both fin type structure and legs, okay? Now, they predicted this. They predicted that there would be some kind of animal that would have both features. It came into fruition, and that was the Tiktaalik. It's known as the Tiktaalik. You can go on Google. Sheikh Google can tell you everything about it, right? So that structure was predicted, and it substantiated the theory of evolution. So rather than actually saying that, oh, because there are gaping holes in the fossil record, it breaks down the evolutionary narrative, it doesn't, right? We acknowledge that there are gaping holes in it, but in the places where we have made prediction, we have corroborated with evidence, and it seems to fall into place. I hope that answers your question, Brother Dan. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned theistic evolution. Does that mean that a theist basically believes, a monotheist believes that? Can you just explain that one?
Sure.
And the other one you mentioned where Adam was created kind of outside of that or implanted in.
Okay. Okay.
So if you could explain and also just mention, is there any problem with the latter one from a scientific perspective?
The latter one being
that human beings and Adam were outside of that process.
Okay, cool. So, Bismillah. Okay, I'm just trying to structure that in my head. Okay, Bismillah. So, right. When it comes to theistic evolution, this is simply the position that God created the world, right? He created the laws of the universe. He allows those laws to sustain. Okay. So one of the mechanisms which he used according to theistic evolution is the theory of evolution. So God kickstarted that process, and then over these millions of years, he made the right mutations in the DNA. He allowed all these different species to exist. And finally, at the very end, he allowed particularly Adam to come out into existence from whatever pre-existing animal that was, a hominid, whatever it is, wallahu alam. That is theistic evolution. The idea that God orchestrated that evolutionary framework. That's the one position. The other position is that that God did everything evolution except Adam. Adam and onwards did not come out of evolution. Adam and man generally is the exception to evolution. This position, there's no real term for it, but I call it human exceptionalism. That's what I call it, right? So in this particular position basically makes the case that God made Adam. So the reason why people make this case is because they say that God made Adam with his own two hands. So Adam is a very special creature. So therefore he cannot come out of an evolutionary process. So that is that perspective. Now, scientifically, as I've mentioned before, that we have substantial evidence from our genetics particularly that whatever is supposed to cross over into the DNA of humans, we see it. So therefore that acts as a very strong substantiating evidence that humans did come out of evolution, okay? So Yasir Qadhi, do you guys know of Yasir Qadhi? Some of you may know him, right? So he's a big guy. He's actually one of the scholars who really made a very big impression on me in my development as a Muslim. And I respect him and love him quite a lot, mashallah. So he's done very good work. So his position is very interesting. Not that I agree with him, but his position is as follows. He believes that God could have made Adam with all the necessary prerequisites which allows it to fit into the theory of evolution. But he was still created instantly. That's his position. So imagine like a domino stack that fits perfectly, and he just added that last domino stack, which is a necessary part of the process, but could be seen to be part of the process. That is his position. Whether you agree with it or not, it's up to you. But that is one kind of position known as human exceptionalism. I hope that.
So scientifically, if a person was to agree with that position,
yeah,
does it then like ruin the rest of the domino process or anything like that?
No, scientists would only. So if you hold on to human exceptionalism, all they would say is that you're making you're just basing it on non-scientific measures to make a case for Adam being outside of the process. Scientifically, you should look for consistency. And they would charge this position in that you're not being consistent with your position. So you've just arbitrarily made humans the exception while everything else conforms to evolution. And you haven't done it because of scientific reasons. You've done it because of theological or scriptural reasons, right? So hopefully that clarifies what you were asking for. So, this now presses me for another another thing that I wanted to add, right? So I told you that there are complexities involved in the debate between evolution and Islam. So one of the things that I have seen is that people reject evolution just not because of the science, because the Quran says so. This is the position that I've seen, right? So one of the reasons that some scholars that I've seen use, there's a book written by Solomon Jalajal and Nuha Mim Keller. These are very interesting thinkers. And they mentioned that we have to reject evolution because Allah created Adam with his own special hands. Allah created Adam with his own two hands. This makes him a very special creation, no doubt, okay? Now, when I looked into this myself, so here's the reasoning. Allah created Adam with his own two hands, therefore Adam is special, therefore we reject evolution. This is the argument, okay? When I looked into the Quran myself, there is another verse. There is another verse in the Quran where where Allah says He created farm animals with His hands as well. Now all of a sudden, in light of this verse, if you're saying that Adam is special just because of Allah's hands, well, what about these animals now? So all of a sudden that argument loses weight a little bit, right? And in fact, so now some people will argue, hang on, in the Quran Allah says about the nobility of man. In Surah Teen, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان بسم الله والتين والزيتون لقد خلقنا الإنسان في أحسن تقويم. We have created man in the best of form, right? Now that is a very standard argument that I have seen by people who want to reject evolution based on Quran, not science, based on Quran. However, I tell them, what's the next verse? Complete the surah. So if you follow the verse, it says, and then we made him of the lowest of the low. Okay, so Allah talks about that we created you in this stature, this high stature, but then we reduced you. And then the next verse says, إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, except those who believe and do righteous deeds. So all of a sudden, if you contextualize that ayah, it's not talking about the physical form. It is talking about the spiritual form that is based on your merit in believing and doing righteous deeds. In addition, if you wanted to really criticize this argument, there are verses in the Quran which tell us that man is greedy, man is hasty, man is very impatient. Those are negative qualities. So you have to balance both. Again, Imam Ghazali, he mentions in his book called Alchemy of Happiness, he mentions in his book that the human being can be better than angels, but he can also be worse than animals. Why? Because of your spiritual merit. And that is what the Quran is indicating. Not a physical feature, right? Not a physical feature. So people who try to negate evolution based on those verses, in my opinion, are resting on very weak grounds. And God knows best. Hopefully that helps your considerations. Okay, from the sister side, do you guys have any questions? I think we had a few from you. Yes? Yeah.
But including it.
Yeah.
How would we as parents kind of make children understand that when we talk about religion nowadays, it's kind of debunked off, it's a book that you're believing in, it's miracles that can't be proven, we've got science on one side, and you're not just balancing, what's the best approach to overcome this? Because, for instance, a question regarding the Adam alayhi salam, okay?
Yeah.
Something can't come out of nothing. Where they take out bits of science and then say, well, this miracle, it couldn't have happened. Prophet Muhammad couldn't have gone to Palestine and then up into the seven heavens.
Yeah.
And not overcoming these, because at this age, these are sort of arguments that kids come up with.
Yeah.
So how do we explain to children, without getting too complicated, that we can say faith up to a certain point, but kind of like bringing both of them together to make them understand that, well, hold on, this is the way forward. We believe in our religion and we take science and we develop upon that as well, and we take the goodness from that.
Yeah. Okay, so very good question. Just give me 1 second to think before I answer. I can only give you advice, and this is based on my limited experience, okay? My particular, I think, way of getting out some of these issues is that we have to be comfortable with areas that are gray. Okay, I think in this climate where Muslims are under a lot of attack and therefore they have a lot of intellectual insecurities, they try to find things that are black and white. I think this is a very reactive narrative that has come out in Muslims. Muslims don't like when they're uncertain, right? Again, this is my limited observations that I'm telling you. So the problem here is, however, that even when you go deep into Islamic sciences, historically we had always a wealth of opinions on any one issue, all right? Not most issues, not all issues, right? And what that tells me is that Muslims were a thriving community because they were able to deal with those differences. It's okay to have difference of opinions. Now, because of the, atheism and, Islamophobia that has come out, I think parents just want to preserve their kids' faith. That's like a very now pressing thing on their minds. And as a result, I think they sometimes provide black and white solutions which don't really conform to reality or don't really help the situation. In fact, they aggregate the fuel to the fire. And in order to circumvent that, at least for me, because I'm a parent as well, what I'm trying to do is slowly basically allow kids to have the ability to question. That's the first thing. Allow them to question. We had yesterday I was at Ibrahim College. We were doing a one-day course on atheism and Islam there. And Sheikh Shams, who's running the foundation, he mentioned to us that he said that there was one boy, he went through 17 different imams, right? And all of them couldn't give the answers. They just brushed him off, right? Because they didn't know what to do with, so he left. And eventually that really put him on the edge of losing faith until he finally came to Ibrahim College and somebody was able to address those concerns. So I definitely believe that having an open environment that doesn't stop questioning is the first step. That's for sure. Do you guys know Ayan Hirsi Ali? Ever heard of her name? Yeah, so Hirsi Ali is a very famous ex-Muslim atheist, right? She's written several books against Islam now. She's one of the biggest voices of ex-Muslim atheism. And in her biography, she actually says that when she was younger, when she wanted to ask questions, her family would shut her down. Now, it makes you think that if that didn't happen, would she be on that ex-Muslim atheism list? Right? It makes you think, really, it makes you think. So I think definitely we need to open up questioning and dialogue. And number two, I think that we definitely need to have more environments like this where people can share opinions. What we do, what at least I try to do, is that I throw a question out there and then I go through a circle with the kids that I'm talking to at least. And that allows people to think and appreciate other people's responses. So you see, even now, I never said that this is my opinion. I gave you a wealth of opinions so that you choose. Having that nuance is very helpful because it allows students to think, okay, hang on, that opinion is correct because of X, Y, Z, but there's a problem with this, let me try this one. So trying different opinions is okay. Let them try. Let them understand different perspectives. That's okay in Islam. It's not a negative thing to do. Finally, is that I think that you always need, I think this is a consistent parent thing that you have to do. You have to always provide material which you think is best for your child to read. So when it comes to Islamic sciences, depending on the age, I'll give a particular book so that they have some rough understanding. And then on the same wavelength, I'll provide an equal book, let's say on science, when it comes to evolution of Islam. And I'll say, so our science tells this, religion tells this, what do you think? Give them that empowerment. I think when kids don't have empowerment and they're looking for black and white solutions, but nobody's giving them, it frustrates that young creativeness, that mentality. So I think to circumvent that, we have to do the steps I said. Allow questions to happen, allow them to, appreciate nuances. So I particularly have no problem when even kids, they go to different, religious schools, a Judaic school, a Christian school, to understand what their perceptions are. It builds the mind. For me, I have two role models who have allowed me to think like that. One was the Prophet ﷺ. So, and I got these observations from Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's talk. He mentioned that, you see, the Prophet ﷺ, before he was a prophet, he had two professions. Can anybody guess what they are? Sorry? He was a shepherd, right? He was a shepherd. Does anybody know what the second one was? Yeah, Tyler.
I'm not too sure.
Yeah. Take a crack.
Please forgive me, but wasn't it helping out with in a shop?
Not a shop. You're very close. Very, very close. But he was, yeah, trading business. Yeah. So he was in a trading business, right? So who was his boss? Khadija, oh, feminism, oh, so this is a big thing that kicks up nowadays, right? So his wife was his boss. I think that should really be a lesson to a lot of some of these modern philosophies that are coming out. So now look at this. So people have tried to understand the hikmah, the wisdom behind why the Prophet ﷺ had these two professions. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, I think, as far as I can remember, so please don't quote me, he mentioned that as a shepherd, you learn to deal and you appreciate individual differences between the same species, right? So if you have like 10 sheep that you're taking care of, each sheep will have a different personality. One sheep will be quite nasty with you, doesn't have a lot of patience with you. Some of them will be quite nice with you, they're friendly. So that helps you develop that patience in terms of individual personality. Now, when he then went on to business, right? When he went on to business, that's when he started appreciating different cultures. He went on to meet different people, right? He went to all sorts of places across the Middle East, learning different mentalities. And that, I think, allowed him to have a foundation to understand different perspectives. So these are interesting observations. So that was one role model that allowed me to understand, hang on, what do other people think? The other one is a contemporary Christian author. His name is Dr. John Lennox. He's a mathematician and one of the most beautiful people, beautiful souls you'll ever see in your life. You feel like he's this old uncle that you just want to chit and have tea with. He's an amazing guy, I really love him. And he says it himself, so he comes from Irish, so he has a very strong Irish Catholic background. But his parents, he said, always promoted him to think and read every religion out there, different ideas out there. And only when he did that, he became more confident in his faith. So he went on to Oxford University to do his degree in mathematics. And he was sort of stumped for the first time when somebody questioned him, well, why are you a Christian? And then he went on to, further elaborating on this process, getting different people's different opinions on board. And then he finally became a stronger Christian through that narrative. So I think it's, what we have to do is learn from these kinds of people and appreciate these nuances. And then see why you believe your perspective is correct. And I think that for me is really the biggest way to do that. I hope that broadly answers your question, inshallah. Yeah. All right, any other questions from this side? Nope. Moving on to the boys. Yes, Tyler.
About evolution.
Yeah. We just love evolution, don't we?
There's microevolution and macroevolution. So,
Okay.
Wouldn't it be necessary to answer what is the difference between a 65 million-year-old mosquito and a mosquito now?
Okay, what is the link between that and micro and macro?
Microevolution is slight adaptation.
No, in relation to your question. You said a mosquito then and a mosquito now. I just wanted to know what the crossover was.
There isn't a huge major evolution between the species, if I'm correct.
Okay, so you're saying that if you look at animals before and now, there isn't much of a difference? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, or even if creatures came out of the sea, how did a creature like an ant come onto the land, or a bee come into the... All these sort of questions is what... Right,
so the more specifics, I'm afraid I don't have that particular knowledge in my capacity, because I'm not a fully dedicated biologist. I know most of just the DNA stuff that I can relate to. But as far as I'm aware, this idea about animals, about where they come from and how they adapted, you can easily see people who are specialists in this field. They will be able to provide narratives for that. I don't think that's impossible to talk about. But I personally don't have that knowledge to be able to relay that to you. Yes. Any other questions from the guys? Yeah.
What's your opinion?
Do you want to take the mic?
What's your opinion on Harun Yahya's books on...
Who?
Harun Yahya?
Oh, my days. Okay, right. Okay, Harun Yahya. Okay, so, right. So, Harun Yahya, for those of you who know of him, he's a big name in the field of Islam, okay? He's written about, I think, 100, 200 books, right? One of them is on evolution. One of them is called the World Atlas. And I've even seen ulama who wave his books, as if it's the next Quran in the air, right? Now, this is, again, my personal advice. Harun Yahya is one of the worst people that you can study from. The worst people. And again, this is my personal, professional, academic opinion. You can take it or leave it, right? So he's recently, right? He recently got put up in jail. For those of you who don't know, right? Why? Because he was involved in a lot of scams with, with certain ladies, etc., in a lot of issues involving zina and a lot of issues, a lot of fraud that does come out of him. And Harun Yahya is one of the worst people you can study from because his books have been academically discredited, right? Discredited A to Z. One of the worst books you can study from, particularly his book on evolution, is riddled with errors. So one of the best criticisms that you can find of Harun Yahya is written by a colleague of mine. His name is Dr. Nidal Gwassam. He wrote a book called Islam's Quantum Question. He has a big chapter on evolution in that. I think it's chapter 9. It's one of the biggest chapters. I think it's the biggest chapter in that book, where he literally points down where and how Harun Yahya is incorrect scientifically. Forget his theology. It's scientifically that he's wrong. So from my point of view, this is the last person you want to touch anything to do with Islam. God knows best. Yeah. Except if you want to know where and how he comes from. That's an academic positioning. Yeah.
So with not just evolution, but generally science. So we hear people kind of talk about how evolution is a theory and such thing is a theory and not fact, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
And also science is always progressing or changing and so on and so forth. So how do Muslims navigate that who are not professional trained scientists?
Yeah.
How much faith or trust do they put in science generally, or which parts of science, and so on and so forth? What's the possibility, for example, that a certain scientific paradigm or theory could change in the future?
All right. This is a very good question. So okay. So with regards to so just to regurgitate that question. So we have this idea that some scholars, some imams, they say that this is just a theory, so we don't need to take it seriously. That's one thing that you said, and that was compounded with another question that you said, in which you say that science is always revisionary. It changes, right? So how can we take a particular understanding of science and use it as an absolute thing, right? So these are your two different questions, right? Let's start off with the first one, okay? So with regards to, sorry, hang on. What did I just say? What were the two questions? No, I just lost track of my own mind. So the first question was, can you remind me of?
People say that this is all just theories.
Yeah, all just theory. So yeah, let's start off with that one. Yeah. So ulama have said this. So for example, Dr. Zakir Naik, you guys know him. He's a big guy, right? So he says that evolution is just a theory. So we don't need to pay attention to it, right? Now, so there's, first of all, you need to understand there's a difference between colloquial language meaning language that you use, with yourselves, not normally as laymen, and then specialized language, okay? So for example, when you say, let me check my weight today, right? And then you go on the scales and you check it, right? Now, weight in colloquial language does not mean weight in physics. In physics, weight means in newtons. It has a particular unit in science, right? Weight, however, when we use it colloquially, means kilograms. How many pounds or kilograms you weigh. So be aware of that distinction. Now, when we say theory in science, we mean a very well substantiated understanding of how things work. We also call gravity the theory of gravity, but you're not going to deny gravity and then float up to space all of a second, right? So there needs to be that understanding in place. That theory does not mean just a theory. It means a very well substantiated theory. First thing. What was the second one?
Generally, in Muslims approach like non-specialists.
Yeah.
How much do they trust?
Yeah, how much you trust, a particular paradigm. Yeah. Okay, so the Sheikh has asked a very good question about since science is revisionary, what sort of trust and how can we sort of appropriate that when we try to look at the relationship between science and religion generally, yeah? So one thing which we need to understand is that science is in the business of providing explanations for things, okay? And some of those things do go through revisions. There's no doubt about that. No scientist will deny that, okay? However, when we say that, so there's some things which literally change as a whole, okay? I'll give you an example, right? So if you, who knows this? So if I burn something, right? What causes it to become ash? You know, eventually if I burn this, it falls into ash, right? What causes the fire to keep on burning? Anybody know in chemistry? Oxygen, yeah? This is what you've been taught in school. If you don't have oxygen, what happens to the fire? It literally fizzles out. Okay, now look. Back in the day, about 150 years ago, right? I think 100 or 150 years ago. So this was not the understanding at the time. People were still developing the periodic table. So oxygen was relatively new at the time. You know, the periodic table that you see nowadays, that wasn't even fully constructed at the time, right? So people wanted to understand that when you burn something like wood, eventually if you burn wood, what does it become? A pile of ash, right? So they noticed that when you measure the mass of the wood before you burn it, and when you measure the mass of the wood after you burn it, when it becomes ash, the mass reduces. So they came up with something called the phlogiston theory, right? They believed that in things which burn, there's an entity called phlogiston. And what happens is, when you burn, phlogiston leaves the entity. Okay, this was the understanding at that time. All right. Now, however, they started identifying that there were some exceptions to this rule. So, for example, metals. Let's see, who's doing here A-level chemistry? Anybody doing A-level chemistry? Okay, GCSE chemistry. Okay, GCSE. Okay, so I'm gonna pick on you. You. Okay, the one with the hat. I'm gonna pick on you. Okay. So, all right. Okay, what's your name? Okay, Saba. Now, tell me. If I burn a metal according to GCSE chemistry, okay, let's say magnesium. Okay, magnesium. Magnesium plus oxygen is what?
Magnesium oxide.
Oh, very good. Okay, give a round of applause. Excellent. Very good. You got it. Okay. I'm glad you didn't embarrass yourself in front of YouTube. So, right. So you get magnesium oxide. Okay. So with metals, there's an exception that when metals burn, they gain mass. They don't lose mass, okay? Because the oxygen combines and you form like this new solid, right? So according to that theory, the phlogiston theory, remember they said that if something burns and it loses mass, phlogiston leaves the material. But then if you have metals now, it means that either phlogiston has negative mass or new phlogiston comes in all of a sudden because the mass increases. So this became a big problem at the time. How do you resolve this issue? And only when Antoine Lavoisier, he's a well-known chemist, so he understood that oxygen is what causes both things to burn, and he was able to sufficiently explain how things lose mass and how things gain mass as well. So now, what changed? The understanding changed. But did the physical features change? Did the data set change? It didn't change, right? So when interpretations can change, but the raw data itself doesn't, okay? Now, let's now come to today's time. You guys know that so for those of you who study physics in high school, so you guys heard of Newtonian physics? Force is equal to mass times acceleration. Yeah, you guys should know this, right? So Newtonian physics is still taught today, even though it is superseded by various other theories. For example, quantum mechanics, Einstein's theory of relativity. So why do we still teach it? Because it is still partially correct. It doesn't explain everything in the world, but it is sufficient enough to explain some things of the world. So we don't just let go of old theories just because they're superseded by new ones, right? What I'm trying to illustrate here is that science, of course, it goes through a revisionary process, but there are reasons for differences in interpretation. Even in one particular understanding, you can have a theory that explains relatively well, but on other features, it doesn't. So Newtonian physics is really good in explaining the physics of the world. Have you guys looked at those questions? If I drop this, at what velocity it'll go down? This is the kind of questions you'll come across in Newtonian mechanics. But Newtonian mechanics doesn't work, for example, say in the solar system or on the very tiny atomic level. So what I'm trying to just illustrate here is that just because science is revisionary doesn't mean you chuck everything out. For instance, where do babies come from? Where do babies come from? What kind of response is that? What's that? Huh? Where do babies come from? The womb, the mother, right? It comes from the mother, right? Now, we have an understanding today. How the embryo develops. It goes through 3 months. It has 3 phases, etc. Right? Now, let's just say that somebody finds a slightly different interpretation. Does that mean we chuck out the old theory altogether? No, the baby is still going to go through that process, right? No one's going to say the baby is not born outside of the womb. That would be very weird, right? Very weird, right? So understand this, that when it comes to science and religion, we should have enough understanding of science. Now, there's some things which are very strongly substantiated. There's some things which are very weakly substantiated. So you have to understand the differences between the theories. That can only come when you just do your research. First thing. Rule number 2, science does revise itself, but it revises itself in light of the same data set. This is the most important thing, okay? And if you want to provide different theories, look at what scientists are saying. Now look, I'm not going to deny this. In science, there are different interpretations of evolution. There's not one. Different interpretations. And scientists are still competing for which is the best one. So I'm not saying that revisionary is not a problem within science. It is. But it doesn't mean you chuck out everything in science. I hope that addresses your concern.
Is there any way for a normal person to sense what is very strong and what is...
So I think here, this will come down to authority, eventually, right? In the sense that you just have to listen to the experts. And if you're really interested, look at what different experts are saying. Because just following one person isn't always the best, right? It's a bit like saying, most of us, we go to doctors whenever we're sick, right? Do we ever question the doctor when we get a pill? Very rarely, unless we think he's a very dodgy guy, I don't know, from somewhere, right? And if you go to dodgy places, God help you, seriously, right? So, do you get my point, right? So usually you trust doctors. You usually trust doctors. And you're not going to sort of question them. Similarly here, in science, unless you want to be an expert, you can only go so far. So I would say that always speak to different kinds of audiences, look at different kinds of books, make up a relative understanding of what the nuances are, and then make an educated decision. See, my principle is as follows. This is my general principle in how I operate the field of science or religion, okay? There are two extremes which you have to avoid. There is extreme in which you take everything that science tells you and then you impose it on Islamic studies. This is one kind of extreme which you want to avoid. The other kind of extreme is when you take everything in Islam and then you impose that on the sciences. That's also incorrect. Those are two kinds of extremes. My personal approach is as follows. Both the Quran and the world came from who? Allah. So if they came from the same person, sorry, not the person, the same entity, right? Then there cannot be a conflict between these two things. Does that make sense? The author of both of those two are the same. Now, who interprets those two? Us. So when there's a conflict, there must be something wrong with our understanding, either here or there. Let's look into it and see what we can find. This is my personal approach. So I don't try to do this or this. I'm just saying, what are the nuances here? What are the nuances there? Let's see what we can sort of conciliate. That's my personal approach, right? So hopefully that addresses it. Right. You have a question? No? All right. Yeah. Yes?
Relates to Harun. He tended to use a lot of the verses from the Quran as a base to prove that scientifically the Quran was correct.
Yeah.
Do you think that's problematic when people start doing that, saying that this verse of the Quran
It says this proves that Islam is a true religion because it's proven.
You're talking about scientific miracles?
Yeah.
Okay. I have the best response for you. Come to today's conference in the evening. Okay? Yeah. Okay, inshallah. We'll answer that question there and then, okay? But just as a simple answer, it's very problematic to do that, all right? Because for those people who want to say that, oh look, we can find some correlation of science in the Quran. Hang on, there are other verses in the Quran which completely contradict science. For example, Maryam, may Allah bless her, having a child without marrying anyone, right? Without being intimate with anyone. The moon split into half. Right? That's a verse in the Quran. The moon split into half. The staff of Moses, what did it become? A snake. Oh, how do you explain that scientifically? Right? So if you want to stress on this, don't forget about these. So you have to have a consistent answer for both. So I think that is a problematic narrative. Just again, to put it short, my personal belief that this narrative started because back in the day, in the 1960s, which is when this movement picked up, you didn't have internet, right? So the education was rested on very special people who could, capture that kind of information and then relay it. Now, they could use this as a dawah tactic to sort of claim, look at these correlations. But now, when we are living in an information-centric society, everybody has access to all these verses and all these claims. And they can easily cross-check it. And it doesn't work. It has completely been falsified. Various things have been put onto the Quran which are not really there. So I think it's a very problematic concern. The book of Allah was never a book of science. It's never a book of science. And until people understand that, they're always going to go down these limited ways of understanding the Quran. What makes the Quran a miracle is not the science. It is the literary aspect. That is the challenge that we have today. 1400 years have passed. No one has produced an equivalent. That's the evidential basis of Islam. Christians have different evidential basis. They rely on Christianity because their evidence is that Jesus, he rose back from the dead. We have historical records to prove this. Therefore, we believe in Christianity. That is their foundation for Christianity. For us, our foundation is the Quran, the literary miracle of the Quran. Nothing else, not the miracles, the scientific miracles of these. Yes. Anybody else have a question?
If one of our young people decide to pursue science formally or informally, or they're just interested in it, the fear of parents often is, or teachers and anybody, is that they will become so engrossed just in that one extreme which you spoke about, in that one bubble of hard scientific facts, that they can completely reject or start to overlook miracles which as Muslims we believe in, like the birth of Jesus. So how does, in practice, a student of science maintain a balance?
Okay, very good question. So the concern that you're talking about, right? So when I started going into science quite deeply, I was also the impression that what is the Quran saying? This is scientifically impossible. So I had doubts about the Quran when I started going towards Islamic studies. So I know where you're coming from with that. My advice would be that, look, people need to just learn to have an open mind first, not to make quick judgments. Because when you think that there's actually a conflict, there may actually be very well a solution. It's just that you don't have the adequate knowledge to address those. So I think the best way to sort of promote tolerance and understanding is to tell, if you're dealing with a scientist, is hang on, you've done all these efforts to go into the science. Can you now make the same effort to understand Islamic theology? You see, because Islamic studies is based on three aspects, right? It's based on fiqh, aqidah, and tasawwuf. So the heart, the body, and the mind. These are the three things that you need to study about in Islam, right? If you study Islamic theology very seriously, you will notice that a lot of these things can be quickly resolved. There's not a big issue here per se. But somebody coming from a hardcore scientific background may have a little bit difficulty in appreciating those things, because this is the realm of what we call in philosophy metaphysics, right? So I would say, just like you have done your homework in science, give some leeway and do your homework in Islamic studies. And then allow yourself to make an educated decision. When we make snappy decisions, I think that's when we go on the wrong way. Hopefully that clarifies it. Anybody else? Sheikh, you have a question?
We've got another 15-20 minutes and then you'll have your class and your break.
Cool, okay. So, I've got some questions.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So, you know the topic that you'll be discussing tonight?
Yeah.
On scientific miracles?
Yeah.
So you'll be discussing scientific miracles tonight. Can you tell us a bit about why you are discussing that with us? What's the background to it?
Okay.
What it's about?
Right. Okay. Good question.
I think it's an important question for them to.
Right. So the event that we're having tonight, it's a critical review of scientific miracles in the Quran. Okay. So I discussed first of all what kind of claims are being made about the Quran, what kind of correlations, to give you some examples, right? So you know how there's one of the common miracles in the Quran is that so we know now the sun gives off its own light, right? But does the moon give off its own light? What does it do? It reflects that light, right? So some people have found a verse in which the moon seems to indicate that way. So there's a correlation, the Quran is a scientific miracle. So the problem, I illustrate those examples, but then I say, hang on, these are problematic because those are possible interpretations, not definitive interpretations. And when they're possible interpretations, to rest on those and to claim the Quran is a miracle because of those is problematic. Additionally, as I mentioned before, there are some verses of the Quran which are in complete contradiction to science. So when you balance it up, you fall into some sort of errors. And that is why Hamza Sources, you guys know Hamza Sources? You've heard of him before? So he's like a big Muslim apologist, right? I think the biggest one from the Islamic aspect. And even he himself said that, you know, because him and his institution were pushing for Quranic miracles, scientific miracles in the Quran, right? And then they withdrew that movement. They stopped this movement because they realized it was a bad argument. And they even said, Hamza Sources even says this on his website. Remember, this is the biggest guy in Muslim apologetics. He himself says that this caused a huge problem in that it even allowed some people who came into Islam to leave Islam. Because it's a very weak foundation to have. If you believe that is a miracle, then it's very easy to dismiss that miracle. That's the point. And I think that's why we need to have this very critical conversation. I know as Muslims sometimes, like I said, in light of all these attacks on Islam, we want to gain intellectual security. That's fine. But we don't have to resort to bad mechanisms in understanding and holding on to our religion. And this is what this event is trying to clarify, inshallah, hopefully. That's the broader aspect, yeah. Anybody else have any questions? No?
Can I just say, the boys have all got questions that they created in class, so if they do want to present that, not be shy.
Yeah.
I've got it written down. Or was it passed on?
Yeah. So I've got a few here. I can address these, inshallah. So okay, so I've got two related questions here. I don't know if it's written by the same person. It looks like the same writing, I think. So one of them says, how do I explain the acts of a suicide bomber, number one? And then how do I justify jihad? Okay, so when it says justify jihad, because I don't know what that means. You mean jihad as in like fighting, warfare? Or what is that? Or jihad as in that internal spiritual battle? Because that's quite unclear. I'm not really sure. Yeah. What do you mean? War?
Yeah, no, let me wrote it.
Oh, who wrote it then? Yeah, war. It means war. Okay, so look. Okay, let me first just say this categorically. Okay, categorically, suicide bombing is haram for two reasons. Categorically, number one, it's haram to kill yourself. It is clearly established from fiqh. You cannot kill yourself. It's one of the biggest punishments that you'll get in the next life. So the idea of suicide is non-existent, first of all, in fiqh. Number two, suicide bombing entails you kill innocent people. There's a clear verse in Surah Ma'idah. You kill one person as if you kill the entire world. Imagine that kind of burden on the Day of Judgment on your plate. So categorically, this is a non-trivial issue. Now, what causes people to do suicide bombings are not necessarily because of religious roots. If you go into this now deeply, people do suicide bombings. I mean, you can put into all sorts of corners. There are economic aspects to the discussion. Foreign policy plays a part of the discussion, right? Political vacuums cause these kind of problems, right? So if you, like I said, if you go into geopolitics, you will understand that sometimes people do these acts because they have been colonized. They feel that they've been colonized, or they've been their lands have been jeopardized, and the only way they can resist some of these things is by doing atrocities like this, right? They use religion to make their case, but it doesn't mean that their case is actually religiously substantiated. This is a fundamental point that we need to understand. This is not from our religion. This is from a modernity that has come out, which is causing a lot of frustrations on the ground. The biggest question you need to ask yourself is, were there suicide bombings in the history of Islam? This is a recent phenomenon in light of colonialism, in light of postmodernism, in light of post-colonialism. So that has to have some indication in how you go about interpreting this. So this, I think, is clear. How do I justify war? Okay, so again, this is a little bit interesting. So we need to understand that this question needs to be carefully answered because of political sensitivities, okay? But you need to understand very carefully. In Islamic countries, in the Khalifa, whatever you want to call it, jihad means two things. One, the spiritual struggle. This is not what we're talking about. Jihad also means warfare, okay? Now, in Christianity, there's this concept of if somebody hits you on the cheek, turn the other cheek. You've heard of this before? Yeah, turn the other cheek. In Islam, this is not necessarily the only concept. In Islam, you are allowed to retaliate if you have been attacked or provoked. We are not a pacifist religion. So you can see in Usul al-Fiqh books very clearly that if your country is attacked, you have full right to retaliate back. This is crystal clear. Just like any other country, if somebody bombs the United States, you don't think they're going to attack? They will, right? If somebody bombs UK, they will attack back. It's a natural fact of human history. So to claim that there's no jihad is water shedding the whole discussion, in my opinion. You need to be very explicit in acknowledging that this is part of the Islamic setup, but there are conditions for it. You can't just declare war all in silly willy-nilly and that's it. No, you cannot kill innocent people. In fact, there even, I think there's a hadith, if I'm not mistaken, Sheikh, please correct me on this, about when the Prophet ﷺ instructed people to go to war, he said, don't attack the monks, don't attack the people in the churches, don't break down trees. He even was very explicit. Don't kill civilians, only kill combatants, for instance, right? So very clearly established rules. There's even a book that's been written by Prince Ghazi and somebody else. It's called War and Islam. I think that's the name of the book. And that clearly establishes all the Islamic aspects of what are the protocols of Islam. There's another book by the Islamic Jurisprudence of War, I think by Palgrave Publications, that also goes into what kind of conditions are involved. It's not a hocus pocus game that people use to sort of do their things free, on their own. Now, if you go into history, have some people abuse Islamic law to make their case? Yes, I will be the first to admit. Our history is not clean. Our history is not pristine. Just like any other history, you have good aspects, you have bad aspects. And people have utilized and instrumentalized religion for their own whims and desires. This has happened before. But from a fiqh point of view, from a fiqhi point of view, no one can declare jihad just like that. There are conditions to be followed. It is a right that is permitted within Islamic law, but we must make sure that it is carefully understood and contextualized, not decontextualized and made into an abhorrent violent scheme. Hopefully that's clarified for you guys. Okay, so yes.
From the perspective of like teenager or somebody who's kind of just watching what happens in the world, sometimes you can get the impression, as a layperson, is this correct, that all the smart people in the world, anyone who studies and kind of gets educated, the Hawkins and all the other people like that, end up realizing or believing that there is no God, okay? And the people who believe in religion and propagate religion, they're all the kind of backwards, not so well educated, not so intellectually well endowed people. So the net result is that if you're smart, then you can't really believe in religion. From your experience as someone who works in that field, is that really the case? Are there smart people who believe in religion and so on and so forth?
Okay, so very good question. So the brothers asked that usually smartness is associated with people who have left Islam, or sorry, have left religion and become atheists, right? And people who are religious are considered as backward and just, intellectually downsided. From my experience, this is not really a good characterization of the field. Just like you have very smart people who are atheists, you will have equally smart people who are, theists. So if you look at the list of Nobel Prizes, most of them were theists, for instance, right? Also, if you look at the guy that I mentioned, John Lennox, he's a professor at Oxford, published several books in mathematics, several papers on mathematics. He's a very well-known Christian theist, right? People like, for some of the smartest people that I know, for example, are Alvin Plantinga, William Lane Craig. You may have disagreements with them about how they approach, their philosophical discussions, but they're incredibly smart and theists, right? So I think this bifurcation between smart being for atheism and then, stupidity for all the other religions is something that has been fed into society by atheists themselves. In fact, Sam Harris, he had a lecture in 2007 where he said that we need to eliminate this word atheism from our dictionary because atheism just means reason and evidence. I.e., what he's trying to say, the religious folk don't have reason nor do they have evidences for their position. So I think this is something that we need to sort of get over. This is nothing but semantic play. The reality doesn't depict that. We have equal people on both sides of the world. One of the biggest examples, right? So in, I think, I don't remember when exactly, but in physics, you have like these 4 fundamental laws. Anybody know what they are? The strong force, the weak force. Anyways, they're these 4 forces, fundamental forces, right? One of the people who worked on this was Steven Weinberg, who was a big atheist. But the other person who worked independently but got the same conclusion was Abdus Salam. He was a guy who believed in God. Now you can go into that characterization because he was outside the fold of Islam or not, but he believed in God. So you have two people from completely different worldviews coming to the same scientific conclusion, which goes to show that this is a false narrative that doesn't need to be substantiated. Yeah. Yes, Mufti.
One question regarding interpreting Islam and interpreting faith.
Yeah.
So many people will interpret Islam in a peaceful manner.
In
a peaceful manner.
Yeah.
Whereas others might interpret it in a more extreme manner.
Yeah.
So who has a right to interpret faith? And what are the boundaries or the parameters? Is it open for anyone to read scripture how they like and interpret and act according to how they see it themselves, or is there some guidelines that they have to follow?
Okay, very good. This is an excellent question, right? So I would say, so basically, who is in the position of authority to tell you what Scripture says, right? Now, it comes down to this is not specific to Islam. It comes down to every discipline. If somebody off the street makes a claim, I have invented the new next theory in physics, and he doesn't have a background in physics, hasn't even studied calculus, would you believe him? Would you believe him? No. But if somebody who is a professor, has done his work, has published in peer-reviewed papers, would you believe him? Yes. Why do you believe him and not the other one? Because he has gone through that training, right? Similarly, in Islamic studies, you can't just pick up the book and try and understand it without any training. These people who have gotten into these work of lifetimes, they have invested hours to understand all these nuances. So you have to go through people who have that credible backbone, right? Now, this does not mean that you're not going to find differences of opinion. That's not what I'm trying to say. In every discipline, you will find nuances and complexities as any other field. Even Islamic studies, you have the different madhabs, Shafi, Hanafi, etc. They exist because they're all valid differences of opinions. So you have to follow somebody who has the right credentials in place. But this does not necessarily mean that there are no nuances. There will be. So when you want to pick up your studies about Islam, go to the right people who have that establishment. For example, my own personally, I'm not a scholar, but Sheikh Hamid is, Mufti Halal is doing an ifta program. So when I want to understand a little bit about fiqh, I will go to them. I'm not going to go to somebody who's a scientist, for instance. That's a categorical error. Hopefully that answers your question. Inshallah. Yeah. So just to add to that, I think there also needs to be kinds of respect for different disciplines. What we sometimes see here is that science is being so exaggerated to an extent that every other discipline is considered secondary or meaningless, right? And I think that is a real arrogance that is coming out of this trajectory. So I think people, when you want to understand reality as a whole, have that softness in your heart to understand that science is just but one way of looking at things. There are all these other ways of trying to understand the complexity and the nature of reality. Hopefully, inshallah. Yeah?
There's a question on the problem of evil.
Yes. I was about to get to that. Right. So somebody said here, how can you prove there is a God if there's so much pain and suffering in the world? So this is a good question, okay? So let me first unpack this, and I think we'll make this the last question for this conversation. So let's first understand what is the problem of evil, right? The problem of evil simply says that there's so much suffering around the world, so many people are dying, people don't have enough food, people are going through struggles, that it seems very ridiculous to believe in a God who would allow these things to take place. If God is really merciful, why doesn't he do something about the situation? This is the contention, right? This is the contention. And this has become an argument against the existence of God. Okay? So there are multiple ways of looking at this. So I'm going to share with you a few different kinds of responses, right? The first response, right? Imagine that a thief comes into your house, okay? That thief comes into your house, he steals all your favorite toys, be it your PlayStation, your Xbox, whatever the case is, right? And then you wake up the next day, you find all your belongings gone. What do you feel? What do you guys feel? Very sad, right? That's what you'd feel. You'd feel very hurt and sad. Did that sadness negate the thief? Did that sadness negate the thief? It didn't. The thief still exists, right? So at least provisionally, Just because there is evil does not necessarily mean there is no God, right? This is an example to illustrate that. Secondly, in Islam, problem of evil was never really a problem, okay? And here's why. Allah has clearly told us in the Quran that He will test us. This life was never meant to be perfect, right? Allah said He will test you with food. Allah said He will test you with family, with wealth, and all sorts. People from different backgrounds have different kinds of difficulties in their life. This is an accepted fact within the Quran. The Quran clearly says this. As a result, we know that this life is a test, which was never meant to be perfect. However, when we want to look at this as a whole, we believe in this life and the next life, right? And in the next life, all the evil and suffering that we went through will be made up for in the next life. Does that make sense? That is why the people who suffered the most here will be one of the first people to enter heaven. Does that make sense? So you see there's this complementarity between this life and the next life. So we don't believe that just because there's evil, it doesn't negates God's existence. We don't believe in that kind of picture. In Islamic theology, particularly when you go deep into Islamic studies, the very terms of good and bad aren't really applicable to God, because God is beyond good and bad. He is all wise, because He knows what we will do in this life and what He will make up for in the next life when He judges us based on our context, based on our conditions. For example, I'll give you an example, right? There are several books now that have tried to look at how and why Muslims leave Islam. For instance, right? There was one interesting episode that I read where this one lady, she left Islam because her father, he was a very respected man in the community, right? You know, Muslim, etc. He did all these prayers, etc. But when he would come home, he would abuse his daughter. So in her mind now, Islam and abuse is linked, right? Now, on the Day of Judgment, I am sure that Allah will take that into consideration, right? Because that is otherwise a decontextualized understanding of how that event took place. So you see, it's not always, just because evil occurs doesn't mean God is gone. That's the thing. Now, if you look at it from the atheist side, for a second. Let's say, okay, khalas, evil exists, God doesn't exist. In an atheistic worldview, even on an emotion level, it is still worse than being in a theistic worldview. Why? Because at least in theism, if you believe in an afterlife, you believe justice will take place. Every wrongdoing will be corrected, both in terms of each other and in terms of God, right? Now, in an atheistic worldview, if you remove God, you've actually removed all hope. There is no hope. So atheistically, the problem of evil is much worse than theistically. You still haven't eliminated the evil. All you've done is removed God and made the equation much more difficult to manage. So from both intellectually and emotionally, atheism doesn't pan out the problem of evil as a better solution. It actually ends up being worse. Right?
On one last question.
Yes.
And we want your opinion on this.
Yep.
How would you prove the existence of God through your philosophy?
Oh, can we just do this another day, please? All right, okay. How would I prove the existence?
Any of the students want to use that as a way to understand evolution?
Yeah.
Can you explain to others? You can break it down in that.
I'm gonna ask for extra money after this. Okay, so, all right. So I'm just kidding. So, okay. Proving the existence of God, at least for me, doesn't happen like that. It's not a one-click solution, okay? In terms of proofs, there are quite a few. That's why we have a whole field called philosophy of religion that discusses all these proofs, okay? You have proofs that try to prove the existence of God, for example, through nature. So, for example, we have these laws, right? Laws of nature, which we uncover through science, right? Now, when you believe that there are laws instilled in the universe, science works on that presumption that there are these laws, which is how we can do science in the first place. So if there are laws, then the question is, what or who put those laws there? Because laws are only things that intelligent things produce, right? We are intelligible beings. I hope most of us are anyways, at least, yeah? So as intelligible beings, we can do mathematics, right? You all know how to do what's 2 plus 2, guys? 5. I heard 5. Who said 5? Who said 5? So, what's 2 plus 2? 4. Okay. A little bit complex. What's 8 times 8? 54. Astaghfirullah. Who said 54? Huh? 64. Okay. Please let not me take back the statement that we are intelligent beings. But okay, so that kind of intelligibility can only be demonstrated by intelligence, right? People who have intelligence. The very fact that we can do mathematics and apply it onto the universe, and it shows that the universe is intelligible, gives us some indication that there is an intelligent being behind the universe, right? So that is one, and that intelligent being has to be God, right? You've also heard of the design argument that the universe is designed, right? So the universe was made in such a way that there are these constants of nature. They're so finely tuned that it indicates that somebody must have made it this way, right? So that's one kind of argument. There's another kind of argument that if you go back in time, if you go back, so we have, this time, then if we go back again and again and again, what started the universe to come into existence in the first place? So this is known as the Kalam cosmological argument. And there are many, many variations of all of these, okay? My personal favorite is the argument from contingency, which I'm not going to share with you because it's a little bit too abstract. Yes, I'm going to take that route. Yes, Sheikh, don't make me go there. But that is my personal argument. Now, the reason why I don't share it is because, one, it requires at least a little bit of background in logic, just a little bit, which I don't have time to go over right now. Number two, the argument is a little bit such that it's a bit too far from immediate experience. It requires a lot of abstract thinking. So I don't want to entertain that, but maybe we could have another class just on that. I would do that for you, inshallah, no problem, all right? But what I'm trying to say here, at the very least, is that there are all these different arguments for God. And some people prefer one over the other. Some people take them collectively. Some people even don't have to take an argument to believe in God. Some people have spiritual inclinations, right? There are many roads to Rome. There are many roads to God. Okay, that would be my honest answer. So I would say, at the very least, if you want to look at evidences for God's existence, pick up a book. The best book, at least in my opinion, on the proofs for existence of God is The 5 Proofs for God's Existence by Dr. Edward Fieser. It is by far the best. If you want to go through it, read it. We actually did an online course on it, and I think that might help you. If you're interested, please do follow up with me. We've already taught it through Fatima Elizabeth as an online course. So if you have any questions, we're more than happy to address that. But hopefully that gives you some idea of how to go about doing this. Anybody have any questions? No? Everyone okay with that? Right. Thank you. Barakallahu feek.